Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Very honored to have this opportunity to speak with you. We had very interesting presentations up till now. I'm going to shift the discourse a little bit to talk about geopolitics. And of course, oil and geopolitics have been closely aligned for a very long time. In fact, no other substance is as closely aligned with geopolitics than oil is, certainly not for the past few centuries. So when I talk about geopolitics, first of all, what do I mean by that? I mean the intersection of state policy, state politics, and the pursuit of a commodity, in this case oil, often with military and diplomatic implications. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And so why is oil and geopolitics so closely aligned? And this is true for a number of reasons. First of all, it begins with oil's connection to warfare. It begins with that. Oil is crucial for the pursuit of war, no more true today than ever before. But this began in the years prior to World War I, and it rests on this figure, Winston Churchill, who played a very big role in oil's history, as many of you probably know. It was Winston Churchill who, as First Lord of the Admiralty, made the decision to convert British warships from coal propulsion to oil propulsion, thinking it would give them an advantage in the coming war with Germany that he foresaw. And because Britain at that time had no domestic oil of its own, the North Sea oil hadn't been discovered yet, the only oil under British control, British company, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, had made discoveries in southwest Persia, today Iran. He convinced the British government to nationalize APOC, the forerunner, of course, to British Petroleum, or BP, and to form essentially imperial dominion over Persia and to make Persia, Iran, a key element in the British Empire, a policy that lasted well after World War I. And during the war, the importance of oil in war was emphasized with the introduction of new weaponry, the airplane, the tanks, submarines. And so after the war, the pursuit of oil for the support of warfare became a key post-World War I aim of the major imperial powers, and it led them to seek control over oil-producing areas, especially in the Middle East and in the Caucasus. And the pursuit of safe supplies of oil also played a key role in the military plans of the Axis powers during World War II. It was a prime motive in the German invasion of the Soviet Union, seeking control over Baku, what's now in Azerbaijan, and in the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies, which eventually brought the United States into the war. So oil and war has long played an important role. For the United States, this was a key factor in the decision of the United States to forge an alliance with Saudi Arabia during the war. President Roosevelt concluded that the United States could no longer, after the war, would no longer be able to support its military forces and those of its allies with domestic oil, would need an overseas source of supply, and determined that Saudi Arabia would have to play that role. And therefore, the U.S. would have to form a kind of role in Saudi Arabia that Churchill had forged with Persia. And he very consciously modeled the U.S. role in Saudi Arabia on the Churchill's and the British role in Persia/Iran. And he met, as you probably all know, with King Abdulaziz on February 14th, 1945, aboard the U.S. warship, the USS Quincy, to forge this relationship. This led to the origins of the U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf, an air base in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, and the establishment of a naval base in Bahrain. And that naval base has remained an important factor in U.S. strategy ever since. By the way, explains why the U.S. has been so reluctant to intervene on behalf of democracy in Bahrain as it has in Egypt, supposedly on behalf of democracy in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, but not in Bahrain, because the royal family there has given the United States access to its base there. So the pursuit of geopolitics for military power was and remains an important factor in the thinking of military, of oil-consuming governments, and certainly has been a very dramatic factor in the U.S. war in Afghanistan. Has been a major problem in the war in Afghanistan because of the difficulty in moving oil to troops in Afghanistan. I don't know if you're following this, but this has now become the major irritant in U.S. relations with Pakistan. But the other reason why oil has figured so dramatically in geopolitics, of course, is for economic reasons. That, as for all the reasons we've heard in earlier presentations today, oil is so critical to the economies and transportation systems of modern economies. So nations have determined, oil importing nations, they must make this a center of their foreign policy to ensure access to adequate supplies of oil. And this is the essence of the Carter Doctrine. When the Shah of Iran, well, I gave you the earlier history of British involvement in Persia when the BP was nationalized. The U.S. conspired with the British to overthrow Mossadegh, to put the Shah in power, and the U.S. then relied on the Shah for support in the Gulf. When the Shah was overthrown and the threat to oil became so obvious, the United States concluded that it was essential for the U.S. to play a more direct military role. And this is the origin of the Carter Doctrine, which I believe remains the dominant factor in American thinking in the Middle East today. And it makes it very clear the oil is crucial to the Western economy, and therefore the flow of oil must be preserved at all costs, including the use of military power as needed. This is the crucial expression of what we call the Carter Doctrine in the United States. All the other Cold War so-called doctrines, the Eisenhower Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine, the Nixon Doctrine, all disappeared with the end of the Cold War, but not this one. This one remains crucial today. To carry out the Carter Doctrine, President Carter created a new military organization, the U.S. Central Command, whose purpose is to carry out the policy of ensuring the safety of the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. The Central Command has responsibility for all U.S. forces in that region. And as I say, I believe that the Carter Doctrine remains today the basis for U.S. policy in the region. And when Iraqi forces occupied Kuwait in 1990, August 2nd, 1990, it was on the basis of essentially the language of the Carter Doctrine that President Bush, the first President Bush, declared that the United States had to intervene militarily. And you could see it in his speech that he gave to the American public on August 8th. That expression became very unpopular in the United States. There were protests all over the country, no blood for oil, and so he decided it was politically wise to change from an emphasis on oil to an emphasis on weapons of mass destruction. And this language disappeared from his public utterances in the weeks leading up to the war itself. but you could see very plainly that oil was the determining factor in his decision to intervene. And I believe that this was the case in the second Bush administration. Once again, the public language was mostly about weapons of mass destruction, but I think that, again, it was the geopolitics of oil, the Carter Doctrine, maintaining the safe flow of oil from the Persian Gulf, that was driving U.S. policy in 2003. And this is one of the comments by Dick Cheney, who was really the architect of the war in 2003. And you could get a sense of the way he viewed this, how he expressed this. We cannot allow, the United States cannot allow a hostile power to seize control of the Persian Gulf region. And even though U.S. forces are now being withdrawn from Iraq, President Obama has made it perfectly clear that the U.S. will retain an offshore position of strength in the Persian Gulf to carry out the basic principle of the Carter Doctrine. And right now we face a test of this because Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, either in response to the EU embargo of Iranian oil imports, which is due to come online in a month or so, or in response to a U.S. or Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. The next round of negotiations is in June in Moscow. Right now, the prospects don't look very good. I think we should all pray that they turn better, because if that round of negotiations fails, I think we're headed to a crisis again in the Persian Gulf. I think military force will be used, and I think that it will take place around the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. is building up its military forces at this moment in anticipation of such a conflict. And as with the war in Iraq, other reasons will be given, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and so forth. But I think that the geopolitics of oil are the dominant factor in this. So the geopolitics of oil in the Persian Gulf, as they were in 1912 with Churchill, remain very much alive with us today. But I think we're going to see this spreading to other areas. Most of you are familiar with this diagram from the IEA showing that oil now in existence, the purple field, that is, oil fields now in existence are going to lose 75% of their output by 2035. I think this is the most revealing of any image of peak oil, or however you want to phrase our situation today, is this image from the IEA. And you see that 75% of disappearing oil will be made up with oil fields known to exist but not yet in production, and oil yet to be discovered. So the question is, where is that going to come from? And this is where the U.S. EIA, Energy Information Administration, says it's going to come from. Now, I know many people in this room are very skeptical about many of these additions. These are additions to production between now and 2035. Many of you are deeply skeptical that any of this will come about. I'm very skeptical about it. But for the purpose of discussion, I just want to highlight the areas where the EIA says that additional production is going to come from. And my argument will be that these areas now take on added or new geopolitical importance. Brazil, for example, that's where President Obama is making more and more trips, where President Hu Jintao of China is making more and more trips. Ditto Africa, Russia, and the Caspian Sea region, and Canada, because these are the areas of growing importance. So the geopolitics of oil will continue, but in new areas, and these will be the areas of focus. And essentially what will be driving this, I believe, is competition between the U.S. and China for access to what remains of the world's oil. As demand rises and supplies, for all the reasons we heard, struggle to satisfy that demand, the intensity of competition in these areas will grow, and that will be followed by the kind of geopolitical competition that we've seen in the past. This will take the form of diplomatic efforts, visits of heads of state, promises of aid, of assistance, of support at the United Nations, but also military support, arms transfers, military aid, military transfers, and direct military support. So we're going to see this, for example, in Africa, where there's growing U.S.-Chinese competition for access to the oil of Africa. And I think this is reflected in the creation of the Africa Command in 2007. This is the first new overseas U.S. military command established since the Central Command was created in 1980. The Central Command was created explicitly for the purpose of maintaining access to the oil of the Persian Gulf. AFRICOM is not explicitly tied to maintaining access to Africa, but it reflected a growing emphasis in the Bush administration on the importance of African oil to the United States. And a lot of what AFRICOM does is to provide assistance to countries like Nigeria that are major oil suppliers to the U.S. Arms transfers, military training, naval support, and so on. China is also active in Africa in all kinds of diplomatic efforts, but also supplying military aid to its supporters, particularly Sudan. Another area of competition is the Caspian Sea region, and this involves not only the United States and China, but Russia. Russia doesn't need the oil or the gas of the Caspian Sea for its own purposes, but seeks to dominate the transportation of oil and gas from the Caspian Sea to markets in Europe and Asia for economic and political benefit. The United States is equally determined to deny Russia dominance of Caspian Sea oil and gas. And one of the ways this is expressed is through U.S. support, U.S. Critical role, actually, in the establishment of the BTC pipeline from Baku through Georgia to Turkey. You could see President Clinton played a decisive role in this. George Bush supported this equally. And because this passes through areas of conflict, particularly in Georgia, surrounded by areas of ethnic insurgency, the United States has provided tremendous amount of military aid to Georgia, but also to Azerbaijan. And this, in turn, I believe, this kind of military support for Georgia led to Mikhail Saakashvili, the president of Georgia's growing megalomania, and sparked the conflict in 2008 with South Ossetia and gave Russia an opportunity to intervene in that war. And I think that conflict was very much driven by Russia's determination to limit American efforts to deny it control over the area. Fine? Okay. I will keep to my time. China is also interested in this area because it seeks to avoid reliance on areas like the Persian Gulf that are under U.S. control and is building new pipelines to the Caspian area and Central Asia. And to protect its investment in this area is building up its own military ties in the region using the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a vehicle to extend its influence into the region. And you could see President Hu Jintao making it very clear that this is an organization whose aim is to exclude the United States from the region. And the SCO has given China its first opportunity to deploy its military forces outside of China in Central Asia. first in Kazakhstan. This year it will be in Tajikistan in these annual training missions called Peace Mission, but are intended to give China an opportunity to intervene in the area. But there's more, and let me spend just a couple of minutes on this before I conclude. And that is, and I wanted you to take a look at this if you can for a minute or two. I think that U.S. officials see in all that you've been hearing about the future of oil a strategic opportunity, an opportunity to gain strategic advantage at China's expense, because the United States, through the development of the unconventional reserves that we just heard about from Ewan, is becoming less dependent on imports. The percentage of U.S. oil which is going to be imported is dropping, whereas China's percentage of reliance on imports is increasing extraordinarily, fourfold increase, threefold increase between 2008 and 2035. Meanwhile, production in the Western Hemisphere is growing, and the U.S. is becoming more and more dependent, reliant on Canadian oil, especially Canadian tar sands. So forget about the environmental effects. The policy of the Republican Party and more Democrats is to get that Canadian tar sands oil so that the U.S. will have a strategic advantage. We won't be reliant as much on the Middle East and Africa, whereas China is becoming more reliant, giving the U.S. an opportunity to take advantage of China's weakness by building up U.S. naval power in Asia and the Pacific. As China becomes more dependent on sea lanes from China through the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, to Africa and the Middle East, this is an area controlled not by China, but by the U.S. Navy. This is the reasoning, I believe, behind the new defense policy adopted by the Obama administration in January. It says the future of U.S. military policy is not fighting terrorism in the Middle East, it's containing China in Southeast Asia, that is offshore in the South China Sea and Pacific and the Indian Ocean through America's dominance of the sea lanes. Now, I'm not saying that the U.S. sees the future of having a naval war with China, but it is building up the capacity to strangle China at sea and cut off its access to resources. This is the strategic design of the United States under the Obama administration today. It is exceedingly dangerous, in my view. And the focal point, of course, is the South China Sea, where you have disputed territories and where the U.S. is now building up its military strength in the Philippines and Australia and Singapore, and where there have been a series of clashes in recent weeks with the U.S. saying it's going to beef up its ally, the Philippines. So this is now, in my view, the most dangerous flashpoint in the world, other than the Strait of Hormuz. And once again, oil geopolitics are at the root of this. I have more to say about other areas of conflict, East China Sea and the Arctic, but I'll finish here just to say that the need for us to move away from oil is clear, not only for environmental reasons, but for political and military reasons, because this end game of oil will be, Ian used the expression that the death knell of capitalism. Well, the death knell of oil will be exceedingly violent, I fear. So it's for this reason that converting away from fossil fuels that are limited in areas and highly contested and moving to renewables that are free of that contestation is essential. Thank you.
Michael? Just stay here for one question. Oh. Yeah, just one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I couldn't let you go just without giving us a bit of a flavour of how the great game is playing out in terms of the US elections currently. How are the two parties playing out this competition for resources, and in particular, give us a sense of, one hears of the drill baby drill positions from the Republicans and $4 oil, petrol, $4 a gallon petrol. What positions are being articulated?
I'm sure most of you know that we have a presidential election coming up, and the struggle over what America's energy future will be, I think, will be a pivotal, if not the most pivotal, issue in the election. And essentially, it's going to be whether the U.S. moves backwards in time towards greater reliance on fossil fuels, away from any pursuit of green energy, or with President Obama, we embrace fossil fuels and a little bit of green energy. And one of the key issues of this is the Keystone XL pipeline that I discussed. Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney has said on day one, if he's elected, on his first day in office, he will approve the Keystone XL pipeline. And this is an indication of a mindset that the Republicans are going to push, that we could bring back in America a golden age of unlimited free driving on the free highways and cheap gasoline if you vote Republican. And that's the message they're going to pound away. And also, a part of this is to abolish all environmental protections that have been imposed over the past 50 years. So this is going to be a decisive election over all the issues that we care about.